Good evening. I want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to the Presidential Distinguished Speaker Series. For those of you who have participated in this series since we inaugurated it about 2 years ago, you know that this series is designed here at Morgan to bring some of the nation's leading and most provocative and thought-provoking leaders from various disciplines and professional fields of study to this university. We here at Morgan absolutely believe that exposing the university community to a broad range of views, to a broad range of perspectives, and to various angles on the myriad of opportunities and challenges that we face as a nation is truly in keeping with Morgan's mission of serving as a premier HBCU and as the state of Maryland's preeminent public urban research university. We have had some incredible speakers in this series. We've started, of course, with Thomas Friedman. For those of you who know of his work, you know he wrote The World is Flat as one of his bestsellers. We then moved to Cedric Richmond, who is congressman from Louisiana and chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. We then turned our eyes to Charles Blow from the New York Times. We also have looked in the direction of Sonny Halston from The View, ABC. We also have had Melissa Harris Perry when she had her show on MSNBC. And then, of course, last week or 2 weeks ago, we had Ana Navarro from CNN. And so in this series, just some of the names that I've mentioned, you hopefully have concluded that we do seek out individuals who are on the cutting edge of innovation, individuals who have the ability sometimes to see around corners that we cannot see, and individuals who are able to imagine a nation and imagine an America, especially today, that is inclusive, an America that is equitable, and an America that is just, and an America that is fair to everyone. That is really what we are about here at Morgan when we bring these various speakers to campus. We here at Morgan, we really value, and let me say this clearly, the free expression of ideas, and we value the free expression of thoughts, and we here at Morgan will forever remain open to diverse speakers coming from those perspectives. As president of this university, I understand the importance of our students in particular being exposed to multifaceted points of view, for such views often, I believe, lead to greatness in thought and to greatness in possibilities, and will absolutely diminish what we have come to embrace this past year as something called fake news. That's not what colleges and universities are designed to do. They are designed to put you in a position where there's a perpetual search for truth. And that's what we are about here at Morgan. And so this evening, we are really, really fortunate to have Professor Dr. Khalil Muhammad from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University to join us. If you have perused his biography, you know that he is truly, truly an outstanding scholar, and he has written several books. He has been at the Kennedy School for about 1.5 years. I, of course, came to know of him and his work while he was at the Schomburg in New York City. And for those of you who have never heard of that, you need to Google it. And if you've never been there, you need to put that on your bucket list because it's impossible, I think, for you to understand the great history of this nation if you have not been to that special place in New York City that I think is still located close to the Harlem Studio Museum. And so Professor Muhammad is a professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard, and he also occupies a chair at Radcliffe as well along the way in the Institute for Advanced Studies. He is a native of Chicago, grew up on the south side of Chicago, for those of you who are from Chicago. And he is a graduate of Penn. He did his undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania with a BA degree in economics in 1993, and then went on to earn his PhD in history at Rutgers University. And so please join me in giving a warm Morgan State University welcome to Dr. Khalil Muhammad, who is coming to us tonight as a member of the Presidential Distinguished Speaker Series. Dr. Muhammad.
To the distinguished members of the Morgan State University community, to President David Wilson, thank you very much for that very warm and generous introduction. To Chief of Staff, Dr. Veal, for helping to pull things together, to April Lopez, his trusted assistant, to Dr. Lupton, who played a big part in tonight's event, as well as to Professor Shipp, who I will be joining on stage during the Q&A, to an old friend, to Professor Stacy Patton, who's here in the audience, and of course to all of you. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming out this evening. And I want to give a special additional thank you to Deborah Bailey. Where are you, Deborah? Raise your hand. There you are. She's a very important member of this community. She's a very proud Morgan State alumna. What's that? Friend forever. Okay, friend forever. That works. That works too. As well as Harvard Kennedy School, where we met some time ago. She's spending a lot of time behind the scenes trying to help make institutions do better by black folk. And I think that's an important mission of this university. I think it's an important part of the work that I'm trying to do. And we'll see if we can get Harvard to play along. So with that, I have attached my charger to my device here. In this digital age, I realized last minute that my batteries were running low and I might not make it through my talk. I also want to give a special shout out to the students because we're here because of you. And I'll talk a little bit more explicitly about why that's so important. The charge I was given this evening, some time ago, was the theme of African Americans in politics. And though we okay on sound? Okay. Although I'm not a political scientist, certainly we are all political beings. And I think in this way, the line separating the function of academics to think about politics, whether in a disciplinary or interdisciplinary way, the responsibility and obligation of citizens to be politically engaged, and then the question of the political use and misuse of history bring me to some big frames that I'd like to focus on this evening. But let me start with a joke and see if you've heard this one. A cruise ship was about to sink. The white people looked amongst themselves for someone to pray, but no one wanted to, as everyone was nervous and thinking about how to get off the ship safely. With tears in his eyes, the ship captain suddenly spotted one of the black crew and pointed his finger at this woman and said, "You, pray for us." Afraid she would be punished for not listening, the woman agreed and started with confidence. She said, "Lord, as I was boarding this ship, it said whites only. When I wanted to use the bathroom, the sign said whites only. When I went to the tables for dinner, it said whites only. So Lord, as this ship is about to sink, I pray that you take whites only." Now, I wish I could take credit for it, but I found it on Facebook courtesy of a Russian bot. So if we find ourselves in the midst of a lot of racial division in this time, I'm not sure who to blame. But I do think that in the age of Trump, we are facing the reemergence of some deeply, deeply racist currents in this country. And I've been troubled about how to think about this, how to teach it, how not to be cynical as a historian about all the cautionary notes that I've written about, that others in this room have written about for our long careers, how to be more convincing and more compelling that the prophylactic, the way that we might actually protect ourselves from these recurring crises of racism in this country might be to actually pay closer attention to our past, to be deeply literate about this nation's founding ideas, which often are quite at odds with the ongoing mythologies we tell ourselves decade after decade about always getting it right. And so what seemed unimaginable less than 2 years ago is now our reality. And everyone has been asking, what happened? How did we get here? Now, I'm not going to try to adjudicate or even summarize in any great depth what you already know. Some of you have read Ta-Nehisi Coates's latest book, We Were 8 Years in Power, and you know that he's answered this question by virtue of pointing out maybe what might seem the most obvious, but sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight. He says, we get Trump because we had a black president. That a nation that voted for a white man of ill preparation and malign intent, and a record that by no definition could suit him well for the office of the presidency, could only be explained by the reaction to the presence of Barack Obama in office. And I don't disagree with all of that. In fact, I'd only add that the Black Lives Matter movement counts too. As I've reported in The Nation magazine a couple months ago, and others have written about, the reaction, the backlash to those young racial justice activists has stoked the same kind of massive resistance that we saw in the 1950s in the wake of the Brown v. Board decision and the early civil rights activism. These two arguments, to me, are the two most compelling proximate explanations, both in this sense from the horse's mouth, the way the white supremacists have reported on their absolute disgust at the Black Lives Matter movement, and the lie, as one told me, the baloney story about the victimization of black men and women and children and trans people at the hands of the police. So I'm here to also suggest another explanation. This is one that is a little bit harder to write in our newspapers. It's a story that deserves greater attention in our classrooms. And I suspect that historians will yet again set out to do this work in the decades to come. And that is that I'd like to address the remainder of these comments thinking about our history with regard to what our students have been taught. And so I want to first just acknowledge, if you're a student here, can you just raise a hand or yell out or just know that you're here? Let me know you're here. All right. Excellent. Just what I wanted to see. I go to a lot of places and the students are there, but the faculty are there, and I think that's one of the breakdowns. So congratulations to Morgan State University's leadership for making sure that you be here this evening. So some of you will one day go out from this place and try to make a difference. Because you're here to get an education, to change your lives, the lives of the loved ones in your homes, in your community. You'll try to change the city of Baltimore and even the nation, or for some of you, even the world. Some of you will do this going into politics, for example, and many of you are, of course, still inspired by the example of President Barack Obama 9 years ago when he was first elected. We all remember that night on a mild November evening in 2008 when he took the stage for the first time with the first family. It was a time of great triumphalism and new beginnings, the kind of moment in America that seemingly built for, where dreams, Professor Shipp, really do come true. President Obama's election was, by any historical measure, the apex of the civil rights period. So many black, white, Latino, and Asian Americans saw him as the fulfillment of Dr. King's vision. Our national memory of Dr. King has, for nearly 50 years, reinforced the belief that America, unlike any other nation in the world, see, even the mic knows I'm lying, could extend opportunity to everyone, regardless of his or her identity. In Dr. King's name, assimilation and aspiration have been the key words of the post-civil rights era, and diversity and inclusion its currency. And Mr. Obama has symbolized more than anyone in American history the idea that racial representation and the content of one's character were the perfect antidote to racism. The notion that the blood and courage of civil rights heroes had led to this historic November evening was captured by the iconography of the campaign. Obama supporters from Atlanta to Chicago wore T-shirts illustrated with the profiles of Dr. King and Mr. Obama side by side. Jay-Z expressed the liturgy of the age in verse. Rosa Parks sat so Martin could walk. Martin Luther walked so Barack Obama could run. Finish it with me, y'all, if you want. Barack Obama ran so all the children could fly. What lessons should we learn from what happened between that moment of great optimism and triumph to today? So I've thought about this, and I said to myself, if I were a politician, I'd tell you that it was for time to return to the lessons of the great civil rights era. And I'd remind you that the civil rights movement had fixed all of this. And I'd tell you something of the usual story that goes something like this, that A. Philip Randolph helped, along with the black journalists of the 1930s and 40s, folks at the Baltimore Afro-American and the Chicago Defender, helped to build a groundswell of the black public sphere to bring about the March on Washington movement. And in that moment of the early 1940s, the possibility for what they called monster rallies, mass protests to stir the conscience of the nation, moved FDR to establish some of the first federal precedents for non-discrimination, in this case in the war defense industries. And then if I was a politician, I'd tell you about the heroism of black GIs, of black men and women serving here in nurse corps, as WACs, and as men serving as armed soldiers, really for the first time in massive numbers on the front lines of the European theater and in the Pacific theater. That they were fighting not just for the end of fascism and racism in the world, but that they were fighting against racism at home, that double victory campaign. And that courage and that commitment to racial justice led to a long NAACP legal fight for educational equality in the South. I'd be telling you this story as a politician because I'd want you to see in the story the capacity of every individual here to make a difference. We'd go on to the Montgomery bus boycott. We'd talk about Little Rock 9. We'd mark all the occasions of the Greensboro sit-in and the Freedom Rides. We'd hold up the names of Ella Baker and John Lewis and Diane Nash and Bob Moses, because we'd see in those young people the capacity for greatness for anyone willing to stand up for truth. Now, if you think that was soundbite history, minimizing the complexity of the past, if you think that in that way of telling the story, we make it seem almost inevitable that these everyday black men and women can always be on the right side of history. Sometimes together in unity, sometimes at odds with each other, fighting over strategy, sometimes with white allies. Imagine what has been the national mythology of this history. The movement has become, even in this day, another song in the hymn book of American exceptionalism. A nation of bigots and bystanders have for 50 years congratulated itself for becoming a more perfect union. As if the politicians woke up one day and to let freedom ring, that's just what happened. You remember when Hillary was having a debate with Obama about whether to give credit to Lyndon Baines Johnson for the Civil Rights Acts or to Martin Luther King. Of course, even that was too simple a way of defining who got the credit for that moment. Just like the enslaved stole themselves to freedom, setting in motion a movement against slavery and its eventual demise, so too did those torchbearers of democracy I've talked about, along with those radical allies. Indeed, in that massive community, in the complexity of those stories, did in fact make real the possibilities of a multiracial democracy in the 14th Amendment, the basis upon which the children of Mexican and Muslim immigrants have birthright citizenship to this very day, a right no other Western nation guarantees. You see, we tell only a version of the past that looks from the present as if all of that was bound to happen, and minimizes the indeterminacy that was true of the people who could not see what was next to come. They could neither see the horizons of possibilities because of their hard work, nor could they see the cliffs that lay ahead, just as was true in the aftermath of Reconstruction. It's not an accident that in the Reconstruction period, something like 1,500 black elected and appointed officials served at the state level and the national level. And sometime between the 1870s and 1880s, something like 16 members of Congress were represented by those black leaders of those southern states. But by 1901, George H. White from North Carolina was the only one left in Congress. And on January 29th, he turned off the lights on black political leadership in this country that could not match or exceed the number of representatives until the 1970s. And indeed, Senator Barack Obama represented the third black elected official to serve in the Senate 125 years after Blanche K. Bruce had served from Mississippi. Part of the lesson of our history for our young people here, part of what our students ought to be thinking about is what kind of education have you actually been getting? I'm not talking about Morgan State, y'all. But I am talking about the larger crisis of what kind of education produces a nation that can see these moments of triumph and tragedy, almost predictable if we actually knew the history. So if I was this politician, I would tell you this story not in a way that actually is more truthful, but in a way that gives us this sense of inevitability that we might actually see this moment through like we always have. And even though I'd admit that according to my colleagues at Harvard, one of whom is Diva Pager, looking at meta-studies over the last 25 years to see how well we're doing in the labor market where discrimination is concerned, found last fall that hiring discrimination against black Americans hasn't declined in 25 years. I would probably tell you a little bit about the Brookings report last year that came out and said that segregation in K through 12 and in college is in fact flat. That across the board, things haven't changed in something like 50 years. There was a brief moment of integration, and yet we are stuck just about where we have been since the 1980s. According to the journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, laws in 30 states explicitly allow communities to form their own public school systems. And since 2000, at least 71 communities across the country, most of them white and wealthy, have sought to break away from their public school districts to form smaller ones, more exclusive ones. This is another version of a secessionist movement. Just like the secessionist movement that brought about segregation academies and private academies and even school vouchers in the 1950s and 1960s. This is the kind of history you don't learn. And maybe you think I might be exaggerating about what kind of history we teach our students or not. Some of you may know that the Southern Poverty Law Center has a program called Teaching Tolerance, and at the center of this program is an effort to document how much Black history gets taught in the nation's classrooms. And so they do periodic surveys of this. The one that I'm most familiar with is now a little bit old, but back from 2011 and 2014, they roughly looked at 50 states. They asked these states, they said, show us your curriculum on civil rights history. We just want to see what it is that is required in your state for all of your students. Well, it turned out that the requirements were so minimal that 35 states, by a curved grading sample, received Fs. You guys know what a curve is, right? So if you have a curve, now just so you know the curve is real, to get an A in this survey, you could, by a raw score, and I won't get into these details how they came up with raw scores, but you can Google it, 65 was an A. So they did as much as they could to help our 50 states out. Only 3 received A's, 35 failed. And the failures included 19 that required no teaching of civil rights history. So if you think about the myth of American exceptionalism, about the need to always describe the nation as getting it right. We may have made our mistakes, but we always get it right. How in the world can we expect to keep getting it right if we don't even learn from our mistakes? So of course now we have voting rights and racist gerrymandering. We have voter suppression. We lost the most important provision in Shelby versus Holder to protect the historic disenfranchisement of African Americans. I'm telling you things you already know, but to make a broader point. According to my colleagues at the School of Public Health at Harvard, David Williams, who's an African American professor, says that we now have, beyond dispute, not that Black folks needed to know the crisis of health discrimination in this country, that health disparities is not just a gap, but an institutional practice. That now we know that we have over 200 African Americans who die every day for no other reason than that they don't have the same access to health care as their white counterparts. The gaps are largest at the top of the income hierarchy and not at the bottom. A story that also tells us a lot about the recent economic news done by some Stanford and Harvard economists showing that at the top of the income hierarchy of the top 20% of Black wealth earners or income earners in this country, their children, particularly their boys, end up earning the equivalent of working class white people in this country earn, and end up going to jail at rates that mostly white high school graduates or dropouts end up going to jail at rates. Now, of course, the subtext that most Americans will take from this is that there's something wrong with Black people. To these economists' credit, they tried to use regression to rule out all of those kinds of factors, and they called it racism. But I want to caution us to this kind of economic analysis because they don't have good measures of racism. And what racism looks like for them is what's left over. That works in our advantage this time, but it may not work to our advantage next time. So we can't leave it in the hands of a discipline that, by any stretch of the imagination, is one of the whitest and malest in this country. And this is not about anti-whiteness. This is about a long-standing social scientific effort to use statistical data to prove the relative racial fitness of one group or another. In a world shaped by efficiency, we have long accepted the notion that some people should be doing some things and other people should be doing other things. And if you think differently, then you've missed the news about why we have such different tiers of education in this country. By simply being born in certain zip codes, unless you have a lot of money, will guarantee that you will have a substandard education compared to others. In a nation that purports to be about an egalitarian society where meritocracy rules, we have built-in advantages. We call these privileges, but that's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. So in spite of these things, we keep telling folks, and I would tell you if I was a politician, one woman, one man, one trans person can make a difference. I tell you America gets it right and that it's up to you, Morgan State, to use your education to make a difference. I tell you to always see the best in people. And while I can't disagree with any of that, I tell you a little bit more. I tell you a few truths that politicians don't usually tell. I tell you, according to an African-American scholar at Princeton, a political scientist named LaFleur Stevens Dugan, in a work called Racing for Votes, how candidates use negative racial appeals to win white votes, that just about every politician, Black, white, Latino, Asian, will appeal to the racial sensibilities of white voters, therefore signaling their willingness to deny that racism in America is a problem. This is the marketplace of politics in this nation. This is what it takes to become a leader. But since I'm not a politician, let me tell you what I think you need to know to be leaders going forward. So, what didn't we get right in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement? Since we pin so much on the courage of that generation, and we teach so little about what those people actually went through, including the fact that challenges to the voting rights bill that passed in 1965 went on within weeks after the passage of the bill, which tells you why there was a need for an enforcement provision. So let me tell you, first of all, that I think we've put too much faith in Black first. We've put too much faith in exceptional Black people. The 50-year-old rules for racial advancement, it seems to me, should be obsolete. There is, in fact, no racial barrier left to break. There is no office in the land to which an African American can ascend, from a mayor to attorney general or, of course, to the presidency, that will serve as a magical platform for saving Black people and our nation from its racist past, just like that woman on that cruise ship. We cannot engineer a more equitable nation simply by dressing up institutions of more shades of brown. Instead, we must confront structural racism and the value of our institutions. We have, for a very long time, believed that with access, and in the wake of Richard Nixon's campaign of Black capitalism, to woo Black people into positions of power. Some of the first Black folks to serve in cabinet positions occurred under the Nixon administration. Now, for your generation, for those of you who've seen 13th or have had history classes, think of Nixon as an unrepentant racist of the 1970s. He had a few racist policies and tricks up his sleeve, to be sure. But by any standard of today, Nixon was much more moderate. And he was moderate in the sense that he was willing to use policy to open up some doors to African Americans in an effort to stabilize the Republican Party's vulnerable victory in the 1968 election. It is indeed under Richard Nixon that affirmative action gains a foothold at the federal government. It's also under Richard Nixon that programs like Head Start were not gutted by much of the backlash against Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society programs. This is not a defense of Richard Nixon, for he also oversaw the greatest campaign of violence by the federal government to suppress, by the federal government, not by citizens, to suppress Black activism in that era. But it turned out that the strategy of Black capitalism, the notion that building programs that would encourage Black people to have access to capital in ways that, of course, they'd been victim by predatory lending, was on its face not the problem. What the problem was the trade-off between that access and the notion that all those first who moved in positions of power who served in positions of middle management and eventually served in senior management, eventually became members of corporate boards, were always exceptional. Their presence there was the work and little more. Their positions were constrained in part by the fact that everyone in the room could feel better about letting somebody in that hadn't been there. I mean, you can't witness the Me Too moment and not hear all of these women in positions of power and not recognize that sexism is just the cost of doing business. Either you are on board or you are not. And somehow magically think that for those black first, they didn't face some of those same challenges. So this may be provocative, and I recognize that, which is why I think in education we have to feel a little tension. The other is that personal responsibility became a new mantra of leadership. That we shifted our gaze from systems operating in our society, from these institutions, because now we could count on racial representation. You know the scene. You have a white mayor flanked by black police chiefs, or you have a black mayor flanked by mostly white chambers of commerce represented, but it's somehow in this mixture of diversity, display, and leadership that there was no longer a problem with the way the cities themselves governed the problems of poverty and access and divestment, or the growing legacy of redlining that continued to shape the fortunes of so many in these communities. We accepted the false notion that the only thing that stood in the way of the American dream for black people, I'm talking about in the 70s and 80s and 90s, was aspiration and hard work. The gospel of personal responsibility began to drown out the social gospel of Dr. King and black liberation theology that linked Dr. King to Albert Clegg, to Malcolm X, and even to that pesky figure, Jeremiah Wright, who made national news on the eve of the election of President Barack Obama. In an age of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, government was a Trojan horse for communism. The less, the better. This was social Darwinism revisited, only this time black first gave it a veneer of legitimacy it had never had. Reagan, like Nixon, went on to appoint even more black people to positions of leadership and power to represent the nation's new frontier. We know, of course, that under Reagan, we had one of our first black housing and urban development secretaries, and the older folks in the room know how that ended up. We're seeing a replay of it now. The generation of black mayors and police chiefs leading increasingly new black cities were now proof that civil rights had been achieved. And then look what happened. Black failure around every corner of a housing project, low-performing schools, or police stations overflowing with bad kids. So the story went. So what really happened in this moment, the part of the story that we leave out? Well, I used to run the Schomburg Center, and in this one space is an interesting slice of a bigger story. The Schomburg Center has for a long time been a place to cultivate and nurture a black public sphere, a place where each generation could look back, sometime just a few years, sometime across centuries, across the Atlantic, both to the continent as well as to the broader African diaspora, to see the voices, to hear the words and poetry and prose of black folks who had come before, who had lessons to pass on. And the accumulated wisdom of those black voices, the voices, for example, of a Langston Hughes, whose ashes are there, or Ella Baker, whose SNCC papers sit inside the archive, or the earliest books, like a book written by a black man named Juan Latino from the early 16th century in Granada, Spain. That the accumulated wisdom of those black voices became the subject of FBI scrutiny by the 1960s. That the effort to educate black people about where they'd come from, about the struggles that they'd had, the genius and the excellence that they had helped to bring into the world became, and I'm not kidding you, I can't make it up, a national security threat. The counterintelligence program wasn't just about suppressing black militancy as it was understood in this moment, the Black Panthers, for example, a display of hypermasculinity, although held up in very strong femininity alongside black women in afros and leather vests as well. Women like Kathleen Cleaver and Elaine Brown, or Erica Huggins, who went on to take the message of black liberation into a classroom and ran a school for something like 20 years after. The counterintelligence program wasn't just about assassinating or provoking internecine, that is, battle between black people. It also went to strip out the resources of teaching black people a sense of dignity and capacity and excellence. I can't really make it up because black bookstores became places of surveillance. In Pittsburgh, an organization called the Afro-American Institute considered a baby Schomburg was raided precisely because they were teaching bad black history, which amounted to teaching African history. These are included in now released Federal Bureau of Investigation reports, so if you're piqued by this story, you as a student can study it yourself. You can read it in books. It's right there in front of us, but it's not going to be taught in any classroom. That co-intelligence program, or COINTELPRO, contributed to, like so much else in the moment of the late 60s and early 70s, into the war on crime, leading eventually to mass incarceration, something that so many of us not only live with, but it visits us literally in the context of our own communities, in our own homes. The sheer scale of a punitive system hell-bent on destroying lives rather than rebuilding them has been the most important social policy in the United States since the 1970s. Now, Jeff Sessions is hell-bent on reigniting the war on drugs and the war on crime, but I think there's another lesson here that you ought to know. One that I think goes beyond this little man's unrighteous crusade. And that is that James Foreman, who spent many years as a public defender, wrote a book called Locking Up Their Own in D.C. And he asked this question. He said, given a century of brutal anti-black racism in the criminal justice system after the Civil War, when African-American officials finally, 100 years later, gained a measure of control over the machinery of law, why did mass incarceration happen on their watch? In other words, he asks, why did black folks lock up their own? Foreman offers three explanations. He says, first, black officials in the 70s into the 80s and 90s did not see mass incarceration coming. These were little decisions, a little bit tough on crime here, a little bit tough on crime there, eventually made for a lot of punishment. The second reason, he says, is that middle and upper income blacks increasingly didn't want to be around poor black folk. Didn't like them too much. And the third is a big deal. He says black America viewed the protection of black lives as a civil rights issue, whether the threat came from police officers or from street criminals, he writes. He says, far from ignoring the issue of crime by blacks against other blacks, African-American officials in this day and their constituents were consumed by it. Foreman recalls his own experience as a public defender and the case of a 15-year-old first offender who was facing sentencing for handgun possession and a small bag of pot. A black judge hearing Foreman's plea for leniency was unmoved. Dr. King didn't march and die so that you could be a fool, so that you could be out on the street getting high, carrying a gun, and robbing people, the judge admonished. No, young man, that was not his dream. In this way, post-civil rights leaders reimagined Dr. King as a crime crusader. In 1995, 1 year after Bill Clinton signed the biggest crime bill in American history, you know, that crime bill you heard about for the students in the audience that was part of the moment of the super predator myth. It was the nation's first black United States attorney for the District of Columbia, Eric Holder, who announced a major anti-crime initiative called Operation Ceasefire at a Martin Luther King Day celebration in Arlington, Virginia. And here Holder says to his audience, Did Martin Luther King successfully fight the likes of Bull Connor so that we could ultimately lose the struggle for civil rights to misguided or malicious members of our own race? This wasn't the politics of respectability. It was what Foreman calls the politics of responsibility. Dr. King's legacy had become fodder for a national trend of personal responsibility Jeremiads aimed at Black America. Now, I know this makes us squirm a bit, because in the wisdom of the ages, the need for personal responsibility, of the acknowledgement of agency for every person to make a set of choices, to make healthy choices, to choose to do no harm to those next to them, is the one thing we can all control. And I agree with that. But make no mistake about it, in a nation where systemic racism means that if Black people make mistakes, all you get is punishment, and more punishment ought to be clearer to us in a world where we have tens of thousands by the year dying from illegal drug use in this country, and it is treated as a public health crisis. Because this isn't the first time that the problem of high rates of crime and violence in white America shook the nation at its foundation. I tell a story, a long story in my book, The Condemnation of Blackness, but the headline is a simple one. When so many white people begin to do harm to themselves and to others, when they threaten the moral primacy of the community that is supposed to be superior, that is supposed to be leading, that represents the moral fiber of the nation, there's a mismatch between the rhetoric and the reality. And as such, the nation takes to improving their life chances, investing in those communities. The entire infrastructure of social work was built 100 years ago to ensure that white people wouldn't kill each other every day in the streets of urban America. Make no mistake about it. The New Deal itself was a massive, in part, crime prevention effort to incentivize working-class white people in a capitalist economy that was failing to produce opportunity for everyone by bribing them with education and homes. Meanwhile, of course, leaving out Black folk. So we have long-standing precedents in this country for responding to harm, to crime, to drugs, to violence that don't run through policing and through prisons. But you'd have to be better educated to know that. You'd have to be a leader and not a politician to be able to speak to that truth, to be able to challenge the ignorance or the illiteracy of most Americans when they think about who's a good person, who's respectable, who's hardworking, what does that person look like? If I'm an out-of-work 35-year-old white construction worker in this country because Congress won't pass infrastructure bills, even though buildings are falling down, and I take to drugs or alcohol, if I die of cirrhosis of the liver or of a drug overdose, I'm dying because I'm suffering because I've been left behind. But if I was a Black person on heroin in the 1970s, then I was a pathogen in the community. I was a threat to the entire world order and needed to be put down like a rabid dog. I wish I were making this up. So for young people, I'm inspired by Naomi Wadler saying the name of Cortland Arrington, who was killed by a fellow student at Huffman High School in Birmingham, Alabama. She spoke at the March for Our Lives last Saturday as an 11-year-old from Virginia. She says, we might still be 11, we might still be in elementary school, but we know that life isn't equal for everyone, talking about black women and girls cut down by gun violence in this country. We know life isn't equal for everyone, and we know what is right and wrong. We also know that we stand in the shadow of the Capitol, and we know that we have 7 short years until we too have the right to vote. She's not talking about punishment for the killer of Cortland Arrington. In the same way that the conversation in Parkland is really not about the fate of Nicholas Cruz. It's about the future of young people and their safety. It's about white children being able to go to school and not be fearful. In our schools where violence reigns, of course, we already have metal detectors. We are already overrun with police officers and no guidance counselors. We are already making choices that make our schools look more like prisons and preparing and paving the way for our young people than fighting and advocating for the same gun control that those white children in Florida are helping to lead a conversation, and that now Naomi Wadler, thank goodness, makes your hair stand a little bit on the edge as you listen to her. You see, black women should be at the center of the gun violence debate, because as victims, we should be talking about what do we need to create a community where people don't want to hurt people. Because sending people to prison and treating them like Freddie Gray makes people want to hurt people, right? So it seems to me we should know from our history if we had actually learned something or have been committed to educating rather than to the gospel of personal responsibility, which is another way of basically treating all black people as potential criminals. Because if it's always about what you do as an individual, not the air you breathe, the toxins that hang over us, both in the environment that black people and poor people live in, but also in the abusive behavior that the state creates. You know, I want to talk, as I close, about something that Bryan Stevenson calls narrative assaults. And he talks a lot. Bryan Stevenson is the death penalty or indigent defense lawyer that represents men and women, particularly in Alabama, who face death penalty convictions. His job is to ensure that these folks are not killed in the name of the state. And most certainly, if they are innocent, he will do whatever he can to ensure that they are freed. He's concerned that although the North won the Civil War, the South won the narrative battle of white supremacy. He's concerned that although black folk and their white allies won the civil rights movement, that the South won with its Confederate flags and its monument the narrative of white supremacy. I'm concerned that in the post-civil rights era, that through all of the hype and joy and moments of great possibility represented by those black first, that yes, we won some offices and we won a little bit of slice of power, but we lost the narrative of white supremacy in these institutions. It is almost unbelievable, for example, that right now in Alabama, the state constitution still prohibits black and white kids from going to school together. Now you might say to yourself, well, why aren't black folks doing something about it? Well, in 2004, they helped to put forward a referendum. 52% of white voters said, we like that language. They tried again in 2012. Maybe the Obama moment created new possibilities. Nope, number went up. 63% said, we're not going to change the Constitution. You know, he talks about Alabama and Auburn colleges and universities because of their all-black football teams. And he says, if players being recruited, this is for you, my students, if players, the black players who virtually make up the entire teams of these revered schools in the state of Alabama, if they pose questions about the state constitutional ban on integration, we'd reassess the cost of our silence about the legacy and the continuation of racial bigotry in that state. That's an opening. That's an opportunity for you to think about what power you actually have if you were engaged with what's going on in the larger institutional culture that is all around us. It isn't just Alabama where such language and names and symbols express themselves across the physical landscape of the country everywhere. Harvard and Yale and Princeton are still working to remove slave crests and stained glass with demeaning depictions of black people. And of course, segregationist names and icons adorn many buildings to this day. And to be honest with you, I even think Tuskegee needs to revisit the kneeling slave monument that meets every visitor as they walk on campus with Booker T. Washington lifting the veil of ignorance. But there's a subtler way in which racism is written into policies and practices. At my school, at the Harvard Kennedy School, we look for the best and brightest. But when we search for candidates, if you happen to be in the fields of African American studies or critical ethnic studies or American studies or Africana or women and gender studies, you can be invisible. You can be invisible because we don't look for scholars in those fields who work on questions like poverty or on housing or on education or on criminal justice, because we think of those people as people who work on marginal subjects. That the intersection of those fields, the sight from below, the actual people who made multiracial democracy what it is in the world. There's no America without at its base the story of the indigenous and the enslaved making the abject reality of subjugation for white colonists the very thing that made them want to rebel against Great Britain, because they could see the proximity of their subjugation to the British Crown and the very people upon whom they were subjugating. And so for them, freedom meant not freedom for everybody, it meant freedom from Great Britain so that we can colonize another. The fact of dismissing the work of scholars who do anti-racist scholarship, like feminist scholarship, is a structural form of racism at the school itself, the school where I work at. Yes. And for me, if I am going to come into somebody else's house and give them a charge to do better, to hold other people's feet to the fire, to be more honest and truthful about our past, then I ought to be willing to do the same for the place that pays my bills. We teach a lot about leadership at the Kennedy School, public leadership at that. We have a Woman in Public Policy Center. It sounds really good, except some of my students point out that it has nothing to do with feminism. It is about representation. It is about women learning to act like men in the workplace, to lean in and to condemn other women who believe that the blessings of motherhood are not burdens to be ignored, or who believe that the culture of discussion does not reward rude and aggressive behavior, and that sexism and sexual predation are not acceptable norms in the workplace. These women are not welcome, because these things are simply the cost of doing business. I say these things to you because by the old rules, I'm not supposed to. If I were a politician, I wouldn't admit to these things. I would paint a rosy picture of a future horizon where we will all walk hand in hand off into the sunset. But I don't believe that that's helpful any longer. I think we should get rid of those old rules. I'm supposed to tell you, for example, that I grew up on the south side of Chicago, raised by a single mom who grew up, my mother, an orphan, because her mother died of a drug overdose when she was 9, the youngest child of 4. I'm supposed to tell you that she grew up part of her life eating mayonnaise and ketchup sandwiches in the brand new projects of Altgeld Gardens in the late 1950s. I'm supposed to tell you that because she worked hard and studied and graduated high school at 16 and taught me how to read at 2, that my Ivy League degree and my successful career as an academic from Indiana University to the Schomburg Center, from Harlem to Harvard, is about all the right choices my single mother made. I'm supposed to be grateful for those sacrifices and grateful for the institutions that gave me an opportunity. And then I'm supposed to tell you to do the same, that you can do the same. You can be just like me no matter how bad things are in your life or in your circumstances. No matter how broke the adults are in your life or how poorly you are treated or have been treated as a child or a young person in society, I'm supposed to tell you, you can do it too. But I've already told you that it's hard to do, that the road paved is cut off precisely because when someone like me shows up, there's no more room. The institutions are not interested in lots of us, because especially if we come with a different set of values, which is what diversity actually means. When we come bringing our full selves to the story, guess what happens? I've learned a new term: you hit a glass cliff. And the glass cliff is not exactly the glass ceiling where you can't go up. The glass cliff means nobody else is coming next. That's it. No more outspoken people who aren't just like us, because mostly our institutions want white people in black and brown face. And if you don't know that, then you will find yourself in one of these institutions asking the right questions about sound business practices, about social responsibility, about why are we taking advantage of poor people? Why aren't we being honest about what this loan says is going to happen if they miss a payment? Or you've heard the news just recently about folks who signed up for an incentive program by the federal government and the Department of Education to give people money to teach STEM. And if they don't file their paperwork right on time, there is no way that they don't have to pay that money back. You know, if you miss your mortgage, you at least get a small penalty. You keep living in your house. You see, we don't talk about what it means for institutions to stay the same no matter who shows up and what they look like. So let me be clear. I am not telling you not to work hard and study hard. I'm not telling you to be proud of where you've come from or what you're capable of doing when you get to where you're going. This is the American story. But if we don't want that story to just be about you, the exception, then you've got to lay aside being among the storied black first. You've got to decide that you are no longer the exception because the rule is not acceptable. Don't be grateful that you get the job. You earned it. I have never been on a hiring committee or on an admissions committee where the minority candidate was not qualified to do the work. I have never seen that happen. And in most cases, I have seen just the opposite. That you have to not only have the goods on paper, but you have to be vetted by somebody who can vouch for you. No one is doing you a favor. And if they are behaving no differently than how all networks work. The people you know are the people you grow. So, listen, success, especially in education, but also in the workplace, is measured in how well you color inside the lines. That's why we give children coloring books. It's an early form of rules following. It's hard at first. Tiny hands have a hard time controlling the crayon. Attention flags, distractions come easily. The crayon slips across the line. It looks horrible. We know it as parents. For a long time. But the older the child gets, the steadier the hand, the more focused the attention. You can see it in their eyes. The bit lip, the squinting expression, and the pure joy when the picture finally looks perfect. That's what education is mostly about. Learning the rules of writing sentences, comprehending prose, using formulas and proofs, learning the law. All the rules are already there for you to master. That's what success means for most people, and that's what it means especially for black people. But here's the thing I'm not supposed to tell you. Real power comes when you stop coloring inside the lines, when you break the rules or rewrite them. Art museums are overflowing with abstract painting precisely because artists started to reject the rules of figurative art. Great novelists and journalists break the rules all the time. What do we call it, Professor Shipp? Style. Leaders in faith communities break the rules and start new religions, new denominations, new sects, new mosques, new churches, and temples. Businesses make their greatest profits when they change the existing rules of the game. We call this innovation sometimes. Other times we call it corruption. Legislators and judges get to draw outside the lines for a living. Their job is to make new rules. What are you really being taught to do in our broader society? Most of you are being taught to follow the rules, to accept the existing practices, to be grateful that you get to color or draw in the first place. So don't aspire to come to Harvard or anywhere else after you leave Morgan State University. In fact, I would suggest maybe you consider staying here for your graduate degrees. But if you plan on moving on, don't go to these places simply to learn the rules. Learn how to break them, change them, to make it easier for people like you to come behind you, to have a rich and fulfilling professional life wherever their curiosities and passions might take them. And I wish what I am saying were an exaggeration. I wish that what I were saying, you could say, he's a grumpy guy, inclined to the negative and not the positive. But let me share this with you. Ellis Coase, a journalist, wrote a book a few years ago in 2009 called The End of Anger. It was written in response to the wonderful feeling of the presidency of Obama as a measure of black people's optimism about the future, hence, end of anger. The kind of analysis that would give a little bit more evidence and texture to the picture that I painted at the beginning of this lecture. So he asked two groups of people, two high-achieving groups of black folks, one members of a special program to help excellent black children go on to boarding school and eventually to elite colleges, called A Better Chance. The other group were Harvard MBAs, alumni of the most prestigious business school in the country. The kind of people who exude leadership, the kind of people, going back to those black capitalists of the 1970s, for whom these are now their sons and daughters. So he asked this question to those Harvard MBAs. He said, obviously there is no magic formula for economic success in this country, but could you sum up what you consider to be the most important factors contributing to individual success in America? Remember, this is 2009. In this appendix, he included 10 concise rules. So most of them were follow the rules, follow the rules, follow the rules, follow the rules, follow the rules. What he really said was be hardworking, have high aspirations, cultivate networks of powerful people, persevere. Okay, follow the rule, follow the rule. But in rule number 9, here was a simple bit of advice: believe, with an exclamation mark. Well, what does that mean? One of his respondents had this to say, quote, there is no other country in the world besides America where a little black girl from a third world country, the daughter of a teacher and a taxi driver, could arrive and in less than a decade reach the top percentile in terms of education and income. Racial issues aside, America is a blessed and magical place. I don't think any black Harvard Business School MBA would admit to a glass ceiling. If that is how you see the world, you have defeated yourself. Rule number 10, never talk about race or gender if you can avoid it, except to declare it does not matter. So, this is what it meant in 2009 to achieve individual success in America. See what I mean about following the rules? This is the story. You have a choice to make, young people. You have a choice to make which will determine whether or not what you do will change this country or keep it the same as it's always been. It has always had the capacity to accept a few of us in positions of leadership. And now that we've been to the White House, there's a good chance that we won't go back anytime soon, because we've already done that. Let me close with this. The Parkland students demonstrate to me, in about as clear a way as possible, what it means to have no limits on your beliefs, on your aspirations, on your visions, on your right to speak truth to power. Those kids are incredibly irreverent. They say exactly what they think. They hold no punches when it comes to critiquing the political class. And I have to say to you that I can only imagine in all of these little charter schools all over the place with their zero tolerance policies, that we have doubled down on following the rules, that we don't want our children to speak out of turn. We don't want our children to imagine that they have a right to make demands on this nation, that they have a right to question adult leadership, even when those adults are black political leaders also. You have the responsibility, to me, it seems, in considering the challenge that a political scientist, Michael Dawson, gave to us in 2012 on the eve of Barack Obama's second election. Michael Dawson at the University of Chicago, a black political scientist, said this. He said, "Today there is a disconnect between black organizing and other mobilizations on behalf of labor, suffrage, and radical economic reform. Even worse, the black civil society that in the past supported flourishing black activism is today weaker than it was for most of the 20th century. Without a mobilized black politics, American democracy is even more vulnerable to internal attacks by those who have been openly suspicious of mass democratic movements for decades." Did you hear what I just said? President Wilson here suggested to us that some people see what's coming around the corner. And I'd be remiss if I did not repeat the spirit of what Michael Dawson said in 2012. He said that black folks' activism was weaker at that point than at any point in US history. And as a result of what we weren't doing, as a result of what we weren't teaching our children, as a result of all that personal responsibility rhetoric, we contributed ourselves to the weakening of this democracy. Because frankly, there wouldn't be a democracy, not one much to celebrate, were it not for black folks sacrificing to ensure that they would have a seat at the table. So for me, it's true that in fulfilling the duties of the presidency with great dignity, Mr. Obama represents the highest expression of the goal of assimilation. But for African Americans, he was also the ultimate lesson in how this antidote alone is insufficient to heal the gaping wounds of racial injustice in America. It's clear that black leadership in itself isn't enough to transform the country, so we must confront the end of an era and the dawn of a new one. We now live in a post-assimilation America. We must take seriously that those 50-year-old rules for racial advancement are now, as I've said, obsolete. And so I take inspiration and I offer to you Dr. King's last book in 1967, where he warned 2 years after his greatest successes that the movement was already hobbled by delusion. He said, "The majority of white Americans consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro. They believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and to steady growth toward a middle-class utopia embodying racial harmony," exactly the kind of vision that Harvard Black MBAs have been passing on in their expectations of success. But unfortunately, Dr. King said this is a fantasy of self-deception and a comfortable vanity. Dr. King never imagined the election of African Americans to office in itself as sufficient. Instead, his truth was the need to remake all of American society. He urged us to become creative dissenters and hold the country to a higher destiny. In other words, he wanted us to stop becoming firsts and assimilating into a sick society, from what he called, and I quote directly, the dangerous cancer of hatred and racism. It is time for all of us to teach each other the truth about who and what have brought black people to the condition of deprivation against which he struggles today. In human relations, the truth is hard to come by, he continued, because most groups are deceived about themselves. Rationalization and the incessant search for scapegoats, starting to sound like the Trump era, are the psychological cataracts that blind us to our individual and collective sins. To find the origins of what was then called the Negro problem, we must turn to the white man's problem. He said every moment of progress was met with a simultaneous step backward. There has never been a solid, unified, and determined thrust to make justice a reality for African Americans. The white backlash of today, 50 years ago, is an expression of the same vacillations, the same search for rationalizations, the same lack of commitment that have always characterized white America on the question of race. If we had only listened to that Dr. King, of course, who was killed 50 years from next Wednesday. So in post-assimilation, people of color must continue to pursue leadership roles as the demographics of the nation inexorably change. But they must also reject their personal achievement as the core measure of progress, and must instead use history as a tool to measure systemic change. To proceed otherwise is to perpetuate the fantasy of self-deception that Dr. King rejected. The future is no longer about firsts. It is instead about the content of the character of the institutions our new leaders will help to build. And if the cruise ship of American democracy is indeed about to go down, unlike the sister in that joke, it will in fact be to black women and men and trans activists all around this country, and yes, like those Black Lives Matter troublemakers, who will help to save this nation from herself, and in the process help to save us too. Thank you.
So now we will go to the next phase of this. I will ask a few questions of Dr. Muhammad, and then we'll open it up to the audience, especially students, because this lecture was aimed at you, with challenges for you going forward. So I will start, and if those of you who have questions will go to the microphones, they are on either side of the room in the front. Dr. Muhammad, if our students in particular are to break the rules or rewrite the rules in this post-assimilation America, they obviously are going to have to undo the miseducation that they've received up to now. Yet I recently have heard some students say that they see no value in revisiting the past because it's all about Black brutalization and being victimized. And in some ways, it seems they are saying Black people didn't fight enough. So they don't want to know about that. How do we undo that kind of thinking? How do we go about undoing the miseducation that a lot of us have had?
So this is both a critique and a love tap. So by that I mean, being Black is not sufficient to knowing Black history. And unfortunately, a lot of young people think that's good enough. And I taught such students when I was teaching undergraduates. Sometimes they were the least motivated students in the class. I mean, I didn't ask them to be there. They were there voluntarily, but it was almost like it was supposed to be a boondoggle, an easy class. So I think really encouraging people who think by virtue of having lived experience that it's good enough to know this history. History is not an easy discipline to appreciate what it offers. It is stories, it's names and dates and this sort of thing, but it really is the roadmap to the human condition. And you can pick any number of periods of time to see the recurring patterns of the ways that people organize themselves. So it's not just our students. We have entertainers who make the same thing. I'm tired of watching slavery movies. But you know, I don't often use the Jewish comparison, but I think it's helpful in this moment. One of the ways that Jews have amassed as a minority population and a despised group in much of the world is precisely because they hold on to their history. I passed a sign in my public high school just last week that said, Holocaust Remembrance Day. No such thing, of course, for black folk in slavery in this country, which is part of the work that the students, I think, should be thinking about. So we've given away our inheritance. We've not given away the notion that somehow we carried forward the trauma of the past, but we've given away the inheritance of actually knowing how to make the impossible possible. And all we get instead is lionized saints and martyrs divorced from their actual humanity. When I was running in Schaumburg, for example, one of the most empowering things to show students was to show Maya Angelou's 5th grade scrapbook, where she'd remade the seal of the state of Arkansas. And the lesson in that is she was a 5th grader coloring inside the lines. No different than any of the students who walk by and see that scrapbook. You don't know what your destiny is. You don't know what you're capable of. You don't know what's going to be required of you. But if you don't even think of yourself in historical time, if you don't even think of how do you know, this is another metaphor I often use, how do you know that if you're on the 10-yard line, whether you're about to score a touchdown or be sacked? So even measuring success, to me, is a flawed endeavor if you don't have a sense of history. I mean, everything's relative. A rich man's bank account is a poor man's pocket change. So you can only know that if you can peek into the other person's condition. And that's what history allows us to do. So I would encourage students to reject that cynicism. I'll say one other thing, that Claudia Rankine wrote a book called Citizen. She's a poet, MacArthur genius. She now has a play called The White Card. It's in Boston right now. It's likely to show up here and elsewhere. It is brilliant, because what it does do is it partly explains this rejection of the notion of black suffering, in part because black suffering is also commodified by a voracious white public who has no limit to their capacity to consume black suffering. So part of what I think young people are also bristling against is the consumption of black suffering, which is a problem. But you can't let folks take your history from you in all of its beauty and tragedy.
Thank you. Do I see people at the mics? Let's start over here.
Hi, my name is Kirk Kennedy. I'm a physics major here at Morgan State. You mentioned earlier about social work and the New Deal being largely a crime prevention effort. And, well, to draw an analogy, here at Morgan State, I'm a physics major, so they surround me with physicists to make me a physicist. When we put black people in jail, we surround them with criminals, and when they get out, it's a wonder that they become criminals. So I wanted to know if you would propose a sort of black New Deal to help with building up the black community again, and if so, what would that look like?
That's a great question. So guess what? If I were to say that, I would not be a genius. The idea of various metaphors have been used, Marshall Plan, New Deal, have been at the heart of conversations among civil rights leaders, some in the corporate community. I'm pretty sure Whitney Young talked about the need for a Marshall Plan or a New Deal since the 70s and 80s. So what it would look like would be the restorative and redistributive or reparative investment in the very communities that have subsidized the mobility of white people in this country since the very beginning. It's just a fact. One of the things that Brian Stevenson talks about is the fact that his father was a Korean War vet. He said his father was not able to benefit in the same way from the GI Bill. And as a consequence, his father died owing money on a home that cost $12,000 in the 1950s that he and his brother inherited in 2012 or something when he died. And Brian says he's angry about it. He's angry about it because, like Coates has written, that the government stole black people's wealth over and over and over again. So what I'm saying to you as a student is, don't go be a physicist and then turn away from a conversation about what's wrong with your people in Baltimore? Because that's the stakes. That's real. It's not easy. You find yourself alone in these conversations, and people are talking about the bad behavior of poor black people as if poor white people don't behave the same. I mean, it's like unbelievable. But nevertheless, that's what happens. And then, as Baldwin would say, the price of the ticket is your silence. So you've got to reject that, because for 50 years, most of us have. And I'm not talking about the civil rights community, although Whitney Young, unfortunately, like the Urban League as always, has depended upon corporations for its primary funding. So if you become a successful physicist and patent something, you need to endow black institutions to support the counter-narrative, the counter-work that is as required as it has always been. We jumped the gun on giving away millions of dollars to places like the University of Southern California. For what reason, I still don't know. But I'm not trying to be anti-white or racist. I'm just trying to say there's no clean slate here. The deck is stacked. So if you want to be part of leveling the playing field, then be part of that work in a deliberate, intentional way, and hold other people who claim to be allies or claim to be committed to this work to the same, and educate them and encourage others to be educated about this, because people want to turn away. As Dr. King say, they have psychological cataracts.
Do you have a question over here?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kadri Lehman. I'm a senior public relations, advertising, and media sales major in the School of Global Journalism and Communication. I will be graduating this May, and I am planning to pursue a career in public affairs. And so my question for you is, what sort of advice could you offer to someone who will be navigating a space where there will be values, ideas, and thoughts that challenge and could potentially compromise my ethics? I guess I should say specifically I'd want to start off working in an agency where we'll be dealing with clients that work on both sides of the aisle, so Republicans and Democrats, and public interest groups that probably I wouldn't necessarily agree with some of their, values. Okay, all done.
I'm not sure that I can give you something at the level that I think you're looking for. And I get this question from Kennedy School students all the time. They really want, they want a how-to guide, how to be anti-racist and solve the world. They want it bulleted. Part of what I've tried to suggest is that we haven't figured this out yet. And the benefit of history is that if you know it well, if you pay attention to it, you at least won't make the same mistakes. And you will at least be more courageous to try things that have not been tried before. So there's always a tension between the kind of honesty and candor in these institutional settings, in these very politically charged settings, to speak with courage about the challenges that actually face the communities that you care most about. And I'm suggesting here that that in itself is a little bit innovative, at least more innovative than it should be. I mean, we will hear, this is one thing I didn't emphasize, we will hear far more robust language about racism in the wake of the Trump era, but it will be less important in the long run, because right now it's easy to seem like what we're talking about is courageous and fierce because the president is an unrepentant racist. But I'm asking you that it's in the spaces of your colleagues who already self-identify as good people where the work is really important and really hard. And part of what I'm suggesting to you is public affairs has to shift, in whatever dimension you're doing that work, away from blaming the most vulnerable people for their condition and their mistakes and their failures. We can't keep looking out at white America and watching everything that goes on there and saying, well, we just got to work twice as hard. Because as I've told you, it's killing us. We're dying from it. That was the message of the segregation era. Work twice as hard. Be twice as good. And of course, it gave us black first. But it also gave us heart disease and congestive heart failure and diabetes and mental illness. So we want to be healthy, and we want to at least stand in the truth of our condition. And then we let the chips fall where they may.
So when students are just starting out in their careers, how do they go about tackling structural racism without ending their careers before they begin?
Yeah. Well, that's what sacrifice looks like to some degree.
Yeah.
So you may lose a job or two. But be savvy, first of all. So you don't come in blowing up the place. And you amass credibility, you amass power. I used to say to my staff at Schaumburg when we would deal with the New York Public Library, I would say, win the argument. You know, start with just winning the argument, rather than walking away from it, rather than avoiding it, rather than seeming like a troublemaker or somebody who's ungrateful. Have the argument, have the debate, and you might lose one or two in the early years. But the more you do it and the more you practice, the more capable you are to win some of those arguments. If more of us were trying in those spaces and more of us felt like we weren't doing it alone, some of these institutions would change. And I have been surprised in some of the places I've worked. Not so much currently, but I have been surprised in some of the places I've worked that you will amass allies, some of whom are black folks above you, who will be reminded, like, you know, this kid's right. We got to do better. You know, what's the example? How many advertising horrible gaffes have we seen?
Heineken most recently.
Heineken, H&M. I mean,
Dove.
Scholastic released a book with a happy slave making a birthday cake. I met with Pinckney, Andrea Pinckney, who's a black woman who sits on top of that. We sat down and had lunch together because I wanted to understand how a black woman could let this book out the door. Right. So part of it is sometimes you young people are the ones who will hold a mirror to the inertia that exists in adults who have just sort of like gone along because it just is how it works. Please don't lose that energy. You know, make the young people right now in Black Lives Matter and Nadia, you know, their irreverence is why young people have a hard time drawing inside the lines in the first place. And we think it's our job to discipline them to do that. But we need more courage, and it's going to come from you.
Well, I'm inspired by the energy that we've seen since the Parkland shooting with the March for Our Lives, for example, and young people there, the Parkland students included, reaching out to make sure that that was an inclusive movement. But we know, we grown-ups know, they're going to run into the reality of politics, the NRA, the dollars, that will prevent anything from happening. How do you encourage them to go on, knowing that that lies ahead?
I think they just have to keep going on. I think one of the interesting things is, so the Parkland kids came to Harvard. They had a public event, they had a private dinner, they had some strategizing. I only attended the private dinner. I got a sense of their personalities. I heard, you know, sort of how they engage. I did not get to meet them personally. They were as close to me as this front row. By the way, this looks like the closest thing I've ever seen to a set in Wakanda. When T'Challa goes before the UN, it just, you know, feeling a certain kind of way here. But you know, I thought to myself, when these kids were talking and calling out Paul Ryan by name, or at the march, they put the $1.05 orange sign to show how much the lives of people lost, young people lost to gun violence is worth for Marco Rubio and what he's taken from the NRA. Like, I want to actually say to them, don't grow up. Don't grow up. Don't discipline your speech. Don't accept that the limitations are inevitable because of the politics of the moment. Because in that gesture of reminding them to remain kids as long as they can reminds me, and this is a patch story, but it just works. When John Lewis has to go before his parents in Troy, Alabama, who are chicken farmers, and he has to say, you know, I read in a comic book about Dr. King and the Montgomery Improvement Association, and I've seen the comic book. They reissued it, and it's at Schaumburg, but comic book published in 1958, 3 years after the boycott. And he tells his parents, he's like, you know, I'm headed to Nashville because I want to learn the nonviolence movement. And his parents are basically like, John, you know, that's foolish. You're going to get us in trouble. We're going to lose the farm. And John has to decide what to do. And he leaves. Thank God he left. Thank God Diane Nash was waiting there for him. Thank God Jim Lawson was there to teach them. So I don't know how we don't take these moments and recognize that this is the work. And again, everyone doesn't have to sign up to be, we need the young man to be the physicist. Please be a physicist. We need black economists. We need business people. It's just recognize that these institutions have never been set up for anything even remotely equivalent to a meritocratic, egalitarian, universal system of opportunity. It's just not the case. It's not the case. Never has been the case. So, you know, when I think about Wells Fargo, I think about black employees. I mean, I just do. I think about, like, where were you in all of this? So when you find yourself at a corporation, you speak up, you whistleblow, or you leave. But please don't be complicit in this kind of stuff.
I think we probably have time for a couple more questions. I see my time taker over here. So let's take one over here and one over here.
Hi, my name is Blair Young. I'm a graduating senior multimedia journalism major. My question, two things that you spoke about stood out to me. You mentioned going, redesigning the rules and going outside the box, but how do we overcome a system that we often find that we have a different set of rules than other people? For instance, you know, with police shooting, we have to, you know, we have to go above and beyond so we don't make sure we don't get shot. And how do we deal with that as well as overcoming, you know, the systematic racism? It seems like it's every time we rewrite a rule, someone above us goes out and changes it. How do we continue, you know, that progression?
So I think we're too inside the moment of what the DOJ reports, the Black Lives Matter activist moment, to fully appreciate what I think is a paradox in what you said, because what I think about is the James Foreman story that I told you, which is to say that most of the policies that govern the discriminatory policing that happens all across America is done with participation of African Americans in some capacity, sometimes just a rank and file officer, sometimes the chief of police, sometimes a mayor. I mean, most of these things don't happen without black people witnessing. And furthermore, even aside from the actual unarmed death and the tragedy and the murder and all of this, the policies, the training already stipulate these things. So I'll give you a quick example. I've taught John Jay students, which is, I guess, the leading police academy in the country. It's called the School of Criminal Justice, but most of its history has been about teaching cops. And I had two separate classes, one undergrad class, one grad class, and everybody in the room was a person of color, Dominican, Puerto Rican, African American. I don't think there were any African immigrant students in those classes, but essentially everybody of color. And they were already being educated to color inside the lines, to think of their own communities as overrun with perps, which was the term that they used. Which is to say that they simultaneously recognize that I'm here to help people in my community, but I've already been trained to think of the entire community as perps, which means they already have a difficult time distinguishing between the guilty and the innocent. So I think part of that, as I've said, I'm going to keep coming back to it, is if we actually educated our own better, if we stop telling our best and brightest to be complicit or quiet, or, you know, just to simply say so-and-so is a lawyer, makes lots of money, oh, this is this wonderful. No, not okay. We need folks in these institutions to say, this is not how you treat people. And if that institution doesn't work for you, leave, go to another one. But we've got to model that. And I'm not saying this is a panacea or a silver bullet. I'm just saying that there's far too much acceptance of these institutions and the way they work.
And let's take one question over here.
Good evening. So how do you propose that we eradicate this pedagogy of the oppressed and continuing this banking education, as well as how do we better engage our talented 10th, because obviously they've failed us going forward, and how does your relationship with Islam help you to be a rule breaker?
That's about 3 questions.
Yeah. I can't even remember the first 2. What was the first one? I remember the second 2. Oh, the pedagogy of the oppressed. Well, to me, I gave you an example, which is to say that the various community efforts to substitute or complement what kids were learning in school has been an incredibly powerful form of community efficacy and agency. And in the town I live in, which is a mostly affluent, integrated suburban community in New Jersey, South Orange, there's now a freedom school. It started about 3 years ago. And this same freedom school has contributed to work that led to a reaction to the mistreatment of black youth in our own town and the firing of the police chief. So our kids need a context, and I'm going to say this really slowly, for storytelling where they are not villains in their own stories. And you can do that 1,000 different ways. Study groups, book clubs, you can do it in a church, you can do it in a community center, you can do it in your own home, you can help to start a freedom school, you can contribute to an after-school program. I am personally committed to fighting at the national level what we do in civics education in all of our public schools, which to me is a fight that some of us have fought in the past, but it's a fight we gave up on, and it's worth doing. Because if we can't teach in our civics what this nation's history actually is, then we shouldn't be surprised at the government we actually get. The second question, I've also forgotten.
We'll go to the last question.
Islam. So, I am inspired by, of course, my family history, by the example of my great-grandfather, Elijah Muhammad, by generations of black folks who took the story of the knowledge of self as a medal of armor to protect them against the ideological, psychological warfare of white supremacy, that he created, as I said, broke the rules to make a new religion or a version of an old religion for the purposes of giving black folks something they didn't have in abundance. And I've chosen a different strategy. I'm not a separatist or a segregationist in that sense, but I am committed fundamentally to the knowledge of self and community as one of the most powerful things. I mean, come on, let's just state the obvious. White children in this country believe they can run the world precisely because everything about the world tells them that they can. It is also obvious that Caribbean and African immigrants also come to this country with a greater sense of self-worth and power and cultural capacity because they have been affirmed in their identity in the places from where they live. So when my great-grandfather reimagined black folks as the lost, found tribe of what? Of the nation, I've forgotten, you know, my own history. That he was evoking a sense of the wilderness of being black in America and then feeding it, giving black folks something back. So I see in some ways that my work as an academically trained professional historian in that tradition. And I think it's our most powerful weapon. And I think it's why, as I said, COINTELPRO wasn't just about men with guns. It was also about women with books.
Well, as Dr. Wilson comes forward, I'm going to ask one last question. A journalist friend of mine the other day said that he was kinged out. He's tired of all this focus on Martin Luther King Jr., and he thinks that he gets too much credit and other people should be given the spotlight. Since we are approaching the 50th anniversary, and there will be many more films and programs, what would you say to my friend and perhaps to people in the audience who are kinged out?
King is truly the gift that keeps on giving. So you're going to miss something if you give up on him before you've gotten to know him. So what I would say is move on from King once you've studied him. He
Get
is
beyond 1963, I Have a Dream.
correct. He is a, I mean, in a short life, managed to see with clarity the greatest dilemmas and conundrums that black people face here and abroad. And he wasn't the only one. There are many others. But it's a bad time to throw King out, given the anniversary that we're about to celebrate. And so I tell your friend to hang on, get through the year, and then maybe we can expand the panoply of voices to remember. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.